Welcome to Archetypals, the archetypes of risk management. And it explores the idea that how we show up to challenging situations makes all of the difference. And today we're going to look at an incredible story of Vassili Archipov. And Vassili Archipov is perhaps credited with saving the world. And many people believe that, during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, he was an individual that, through his actions, helped avert nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so we'll get into that story here in the next few minutes. And this is brought to you by Archetypal, and we go by the tagline, "Safety is an inside job." So one of the tools we use at Archetypal is archetypes to help us understand kind of how we show up to situations, and in understanding how we show up, we have a better understanding of what actions we might take. And in this case study, we're going to look at how Vassili showed up as, the hero and perhaps the caregiver, somebody who's compassionate and looks into the well-being of others. Um, and and that it was a kind of his expansive journey that led to all of our safety. And and the human hazard management model, the hero shows up in or expresses courage, and the caregiver is a graceful individual. So we'll use those two ideas to describe Vassili Archipov. Now, the background to this is that back in 1962, the United States on a U-2 overflight of Cuba discovered Soviet missiles being deployed on the island just 90 miles south of Florida. And so this was a problem because what that gave the USSR was first strike capability in the United States. And they deployed medium range missiles on the island of Cuba. And those medium range missiles could target major cities on the eastern side of the United States. They couldn't reach Seattle, or perhaps, maybe just barely Los Angeles, but it put the United States in a vulnerable position. And so this was really uncomfortable for President John F. Kennedy, who you can see here bending over right here in this slide. And when they got this information, they realized that they needed to do something. And what's really fascinating is that most stories about the Cuban Missile Crisis focus on Kennedy and Khrushchev, and this little vignette shows us how little control those two leaders actually had of this situation, because it was the people, the frontline people on the ground, that had a lot more control in their hands. And so that's really interesting. And so during 13 days in October, there was a deadlock between the United States and the Soviet Union over missiles in Cuba. And Curtis LeMay, which was one of the four-star generals that was advising President Kennedy, he wanted to invade Cuba, like no holds barred, just like fully invade Cuba. And at one point, he even said to John F. Kennedy, "You're in a bad fix, Mr. President." And John F. Kennedy replied to him, "Well, I actually think you're in it with me." And so his own advisors were trying to persuade Kennedy to go to war. And Kennedy did his part in this whole story, but it's not the whole story. And Kennedy decided to put a quarantine around Cuba, which is really a military blockade, but the blockade is an act of war. And so they used the word quarantine. And what that meant was US military or Navy ships surrounded the island of Cuba, and they stopped shipments from coming from the USSR. Now, during this quarantine or blockade, um, they recognized that there was a Soviet sub in the area, and it was a diesel-powered Foxtrot class B-59 submarine. Now, what they didn't know back then was that this submarine was carrying a nuclear torpedo. So it was armed with nukes. And on board was Captain Satvitsky, political officer Masleninov, and Vassili Archipov. And the three of them were in an argument about what to do. The captain was already convinced that they were at war. The submarine had been under radio silence for some time. They hadn't had any communications. And so, you can imagine that the mind starts playing tricks on the people on board, and they don't know what's going on. They were tuning into radio transmissions, but they didn't really understand. They understood that the situation of the political situation was really serious, and the captain was convinced. And so when they get to the blockade, the captain really wanted to launch the nuclear torpedo at these American ships. And Vassili Archipov had the third key, so to speak, and he completely refused, 100%, against the other two officers. And so he stood his ground. And the reason why he stood his ground is that he had been on the K-19, and the K-19 2 years before had a coolant problem. It was a nuclear submarine, USSR nuclear submarine, and Vassili Archipov had seen what nuclear poisoning or radioactive poisoning did to people. And he'd seen that actually 15 people had died after that event on that submarine. And so he understood consequence. Subsequently, the USS Beale, once they decided not to launch because of Archipov, the USS Beale launched depth charges and forced the sub to the surface. And the stressful situation was now alleviated, and the submarine could actually open up its hatch, and the crew members could get air, and they came within a hair's breadth of starting a nuclear war. And Vassili Archipov remained calm, and it was kind of his experience with the K-19 reactor and coolant, that lack of coolant with the reactor, that helped him understand the consequence of launching a nuclear weapon. And he was outnumbered and under, extreme stress. It was 100 degrees inside their submarine, and he was still able to elevate himself from impulse, reacting to the situation with impulse, and he elevated himself to a response, and his response was profoundly graceful, to the benefit of all of us. And so he navigated extreme adversity. And so he embodied the archetypes of the hero and the caregiver for all of us that exist today. And yeah, averted disaster, and exemplified the practice of being courageous and the practice of being graceful. And so, these cards that we've developed at Archetypal, this is the grace of self-control. And so Vassili Archipov he exhibited the grace of self-control. He stewarded a peaceful resolution. So instead of, the hubris of kind of lack of stewardship, he exhibited this as stewarding a peaceful response. And he also um, exhibited the grace of right action. He took the right action in a crisis situation. So remember that safety is an inside job, and how we show up makes a difference. So if you want to gain more tools in your risk management arsenal, um, join us on a course, 2 hour or 5 week, 1 hour or 90 minutes a week, and gain some tools in managing risk management as an inside job. Thanks for your attention. Take care.